I've been scuba diving for over 20 years and have logged close to 2,000 dives. So it goes without saying that, in all my years of diving, I've had some pretty crazy things happen to me underwater. First story, I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "You need to get a light and shine it into the water right now." I think the shock of my scream, combined with the fact that someone else was missing, made them react quickly. I grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "Hey, are you okay? You look like you're having a seizure." He responded with a panicked look on his face. "No, I'm not okay. I was out on a dive trip with some friends, and we were exploring a local lake that is known for its clear water and excellent visibility. We swam down to about 40 feet or 12 meters, and we started to see some really cool stuff. There were schools of bluegill sunfish everywhere, and we were even able to see some smallmouth bass hiding in the weeds. We continued our descent to around 60 feet or 80 meters. I want to hear about your scariest scuba diving experience. Please leave a comment below and let me know what your scariest dive was. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. At this depth, the sunlight doesn't penetrate anymore, so it's pitch black. We arrived at the lake and we got everything set up for a day of fun. The visibility was indeed excellent. It sounded like someone was hitting the side of the boat. As I was making my way to the top, I kept looking over my shoulder to see if the turtle was following me. Once I got back to the surface, I looked around frantically, trying to find my buddy. I finally spotted him on the other side of the boat and yelled at him to get going. Thankfully, both of us were able to escape unharmed. We looked over the edge and saw nothing. Then the banging started again. Whatever was down there seemed to be getting closer and closer. I motioned for my buddy to turn his light on, and when he did, he screamed. The thing that was coming towards us was a massive snapping turtle. To make matters worse, it was heading straight for me. In fact, it was one of those perfect days where you can see 100 feet or 30 meters, and everything looks amazing. We jumped into the water and headed to our favorite spot on the lake. He said, My hands are cramping." His hands were completely curled up, and he could barely move them. I immediately knew that something was wrong. Even though we were in a freshwater quarry, it was still a very warm day, and there was no way that he should have gotten that cold. I signaled for him to take his gloves off, but he shook his head frantically. He then started to scream at the top of his lungs. This quarry is located in the middle of a forest, so people often hike around the perimeter. At that moment, I feared that we would have company. Thankfully, they shone the light into the water, and it illuminated the face of a very scared woman. I could tell that we needed to get to a hospital as fast as possible. We loaded him into my truck and raced him to the emergency room. At the hospital, they gave him fluids, and eventually his hands started to go back to normal. It turns out that he had severe exposure-related Basically, he lost control of his muscles because his body reacted to the cold water. Since he was already suffering from muscle fatigue from a busy day of training, his body wasn't able to compensate. Thankfully, he made a full recovery after a couple of days. But this really was one of the scariest things I've ever seen while scuba diving. She had her mouth open wide, which made it look like she was screaming silently. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was holding her arms out like she was trying to grab onto something. I instantly felt embarrassed. Of course she was scared. If someone suddenly appeared in the dark water with their mouth wide open, I would be terrified as well. I tried my best to calm her down and help her get back on the boat. But once we got her out of the water, she didn't say a word. She just ran to the front of the boat and threw up all over the side. Needless to say, nobody went back into the water that night. Now this dive was not in particularly deep water. In fact, we were only down to about 80 feet or 5 meters. We were doing a dive in a quarry that was full of fresh water. As we were swimming around, he told me that he was feeling very cold. He said his shoulders were really cold, and he was starting to get the shakes a little bit. He asked me if he should end the dive and go back up. I told him that he could make that decision for himself, but I suggested that he try to keep things in perspective. I told him that, even if he was cold, the chances of hypothermia were very low in such a warm environment. Also, he was wearing a 7mm wetsuit, so it wasn't like the water temperature was going to affect his body temperature quickly. I convinced him to stay down a little bit longer and thankfully he listened to me. A dive I did while I was working as a liveaboard instructor in the Red Sea. The Red Sea is world famous for its incredible soft coral, and the Fury Shoals area is one of the best places to see it. I was out on a trip with a group of divers, and we were all getting ready to do a night dive on the Spurge Reef. As we made our way to the dive site, the wind picked up and the waves started to get bigger. By the time we got to the site, there was a fair amount of current. We anchored the boat and we let the divers get into the water and get set up on the reef. And then once everything was okay, we let them head off into the darkness to explore the reef. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 true horror stories from my scuba diving career. Just as we got back to the boat, I saw something floating in the darkness. It was pale white and it was moving through the water with the current. It didn't look like any fish I recognized, nor did it resemble anything that could possibly be a sea turtle. At this point, my mind started racing. What could it be? My imagination started running wild. All I knew is that I wanted nothing more than to get that thing away from me. I grabbed onto the ladder of the boat and started climbing up. As I looked down at the water, I saw the form resurface again. It was heading straight for me. I couldn't help myself. I screamed, "Yeah, I know," big and loud. That may sound funny to you now, but trust me, it was real scary. As the dive progressed, the current continued to get stronger and stronger until it was almost ripping us off the reef. At this point, we were all trying to make our way back to the boat. The divers started heading in that direction. The boat was anchored on the northern end of the reef, but we started seeing divers start to arrive on the southern end. They were all really shaken up, and rightfully so. It wasn't a fun dive. Now, once I got to the top of the ladder, I reached back down and grabbed the person who was closest to me and pulled them up onto the boat. My next scuba diving horror story took place while I was doing a checkout dive with a brand new open water student. But as soon as we got back to the surface, he started shaking uncontrollably. I finally managed to convince him to take his gloves off, and the second that he did, his hands started to swell up. My final scuba diving horror story was one that happened last year, during the summer of 2021. This particular lake has a sandy bottom. In the shallower areas, you can see small pebbles and rocks mixed in with the sand. We turned our lights off and got ready to explore the darkness, but within a few seconds, we started to hear something strange. In a panic, I turned my light on and swam as hard as I could to the surface. Now it's time for me to pass the stories along to you.